Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Connections 24. My name is Michael Mosser. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Disinformation Lab here at the University of Texas at Austin, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all this morning. We've got a great program lined up for you today. It's not my job to do the introduction of the program. You'll hear that in a minute. My job is to welcome you all, to thank some very important people without whom we wouldn't be here, and to get us ready for an amazing day. So, starting with the thanks that I had mentioned, right? I want to thank our sponsors for helping put everything that you see out there in the lobby, everything that you're going to see over the next couple of days, for helping us put that together. And so, not in any particular order, I want to thank the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin, the McCombs School of Business here at UT Austin, the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Eurasian Studies here at UT, the Defense Research Advancement Program here at UT, the Moody College of Communications, the Strauss Center for International Security, the Clemens Center for National Security and Law, Academic Studies Press, and the Ohio State University for helping pull these things. We are very much looking forward to a great week here and a great 3 days here. As you saw in the video, take notes, spend time talking to each other, get engaged. This is not a passive participation kind of conference. We want you to be actively engaged. We want you to actively take something from this and contribute as well. I'm very much looking forward to participating over the next couple days. I want to make sure that we're all in this together. I want to thank, again, besides our sponsors, I want to thank everybody who helped us pull this together, including our advisory board, many of whom are here today, our volunteers. You have seen them, you've interacted with them, getting your name tags and everything along those lines. Our co-chairs, Michelle Daniel and Sally Dixon, both of whom many of you have interacted with. These are the folks, yeah, absolutely, round of applause. These are the without whom folks, a conference like this doesn't happen. And I really could not be here without them, and I appreciate everything they've put together for us. So, with no further ado, I want to turn it over to our MC for the day, Robin Lerner. You can find Robin's bio in the pamphlet in the program. Make sure to read up on her, read up on all of the presenters. It's going to be a great day. Thanks, everybody. See you in a bit. Robin.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see your faces here. As Michael said, I'm Robin Lerner, and I'm a proud member of the advisory board here for Connections. So you know these kinds of conferences take months and months of collaborative work, and I would love all of you to find out, look through who's on the advisory board. There's been a lot of collaboration and help to put this thing together, but really it is Sally and Michelle, so thank you for bringing this to us. Before we go, I get to do all these fun little reminders. You know who you are if you're the one who doesn't put your phone on silent and then it rings in the middle of a conference. So let's try to put our phones on vibrate or on silent. That would be helpful. We do very much encourage all of you to engage on social media, whatever platform you prefer, during the conference. You saw the hashtags before. We would just say, you know, just a reminder, we are in a publicly funded institution. So while we do want vigorous opinions and reporting out, just keep it civil and diplomatic if you don't mind. But please do. These are some challenging topics, which is exactly what we want to get into here. So there are several volunteers. You've seen them around. Nick and Kate, I think if you have any issues or problems or questions, please don't hesitate to find our volunteers. We also love vigorous discussions, maybe more outside the room during the panels than inside at the audience, but do feel free to chit-chat with your neighbor, but quietly. Okay, that's it. We're really excited to get underway. So I will be coming up and down to introduce our several panels, but we're going to start with our keynote today. So I'm going to invite my co-advisory board member, Lee McIntyre, to come on up and introduce our keynote. Thank you.
I want to get right to things. I'm doing a panel in a little bit called Tip of the Spear. Peter Pomerantsev is the whole damn spear. You've read his work, you know who he is. Peter.
God. Well, just in case you haven't read my work, I'll try to integrate it into my keynote now. So one of the really quite structural changes that has happened with the onset of social media, as opposed to the old media of newspapers and radio and TV, but especially newspapers, is a shift in our sense of time. I mean, those of you old enough to have gotten newspapers every day, or maybe you or your parents would stack them in the corner, and you'd see them yellowing with time, and every day there would be a new newspaper with a new date. Newspapers ordered space and time. They gave you a sense of things progressing. News was new. Social media has completely warped that. When you get your news on Facebook or TikTok for a while yet, or wherever you get it, it doesn't come in an order of time. Things swim up from 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 4 years ago, in a completely illogical order, or rather a logic based around your interests or your narcissism. So that sense of progress has really, really broken down, which is a very, very long sort of intro into the sort of sense of déjà vu that I had when I was on my way here this morning. I couldn't tell what year it was. Because as I was readying my speech, I realized I was going to talk about Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin launching vast disinformation campaigns to his own people in Eastern Europe, and also preparing to in America, which is exactly what we were talking about in 2014, 2015, 2016. If anything, all that's happened is the disinformation has got bigger, and the invasion of Ukraine has got even more vicious and bloodthirsty. But in this whole debate that we're going to be having over the next few days, in a sense, there's this sense that we've had no progress at all. If anything, things have got worse. There seems to be even more polarization. Inside democracies, people seem to be echo-chambered, if we can use that word, and it's a controversial one for academics, into polarized, separate worlds, undermining the premise of a common public sphere. And yet, despite so much having stayed the same or having gotten worse, I do think there's been vast progress. Vast progress, at least in the sphere of expertise and ideas about how we deal with this crisis. Firstly, I think that, at least within the expert community, there's been an understanding of how we might think about regulating these issues. I remember between 2016 and 2020, these kind of huge fights happening between people who are all concerned with how you save democracy from disinformation, but with a huge amount of infighting. I remember people like myself who are very hawkish on the problem of foreign malign intervention and calling for its regulation, bumping head on with people who are our friends and our kind of counterparts and wanting to defend democracy from the human rights sphere, saying, whoa, that is against the First Amendment. Any kind of regulation of speech is against Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights. And over a long period of several years, we actually came to a common position. We decided that we're not going to focus on regulating types of speech, content. We're going to focus on regulating the systems, behaviors. We redefined or refocused the definition of disinformation away from content to types of behavior. Platforms came up with the idea of coordinated, inauthentic behavior that we all agreed could be regulated. Some of us, thinking of David Kay, who was the UN Ombudsman for freedom of expression, and others, flipped the whole idea of disinformation rather beautifully and said the real censorship that we face is our lack of access in understanding the information environment around us. The fact that we do not understand why algorithms show us one thing and not another, undermining our sense of time. The fact that we don't know which of our data is being used. So as a community, we arrived at a place about how you could think about regulating the space. In the sphere of media, there's been incredible experiments from Taiwan to Estonia to the US about how you might build platforms that actually enhance interaction, that enhance democratic discourse. I'm thinking of initiatives like vTaiwan, which is an algorithm that, unlike Twitter or others, actually promotes people engaging with each other in fruitful debate. And when it comes to challenging and undermining the sort of information war that Russia wages, nobody is better than Tom Kent, who's with us this weekend, in describing how we should fight back against dictatorships who weaponize information. So even though nothing seems to have changed, in terms of understanding how we start to deal with the crisis of democracy and disinformation, the theme of our conference, I think we've actually arrived at a series of potential solutions. Of course, most of these only exist on the level of intent and theory at present. We see the beginnings of them in the EU regulation around the Digital Services Act. There's an excellent article about that I saw in the magazine. We see the beginnings of it in small university and civil society experiments about what sort of content we can produce and what sort of platforms we can design. I very much hope that this event can be a watershed on the way to going from ideas into implementation. Yeah. At the moment, we are still losing to Putin, to anybody out there who is ravaging democracy with disinformation. But I think now we have a battle plan. That is the difference from 2014. And I very much hope the community of people gathered here will be part of the implementation. Ça va? That's it. We can now talk, Lee. Yeah.
Okay. Just the two of them?
Okay, that should work. Very good. Peter, I'm a philosopher, and I have written about post-truth and belief and science denial and things like this. And when I first began to realize that the problem underlying all of this was disinformation, your work came up again and again and again. And to hear you say that we're losing worries me greatly. So we do have a battle plan, but as a philosopher, I want to ask you an inconvenient question. Just start, and I'd warned you, a Socratic kind of a question to start this. Because the thing that worries me over time is not simply that we're not going to have enough time to execute our battle plan, or that we've got enough people attuned to it, or that the media is paying attention. I want to raise a kind of a provocative question, which is this. What if the point of disinformation is not merely to convince someone that a falsehood is true? What if the point of disinformation is, at least in part, to provide a narrative for people who don't care whether the information that they're receiving is true. That is, they're so steeped in ideology, so hermetically sealed in what it is that they want to believe, that there's a distinction at work that we have to take seriously. I ask you to think of the difference between these two things. I believe that X is true versus I don't care whether X is false. And that is, I raise that because I've seen that with flat earthers, with anti-vaxxers, with climate deniers, and all the work that I've done on science denial. And if that's now the problem that we're facing with disinformation on the political level, we're in even more trouble.
So, is this on? So, to be honest, it's kind of, I suppose the question we need to ask is, why would people desire facts in the first place? Facts are generally highly unpleasant things. They tell us about our limitations. They tell us about our defects. At the end of the day, the biggest fact that we spend our life avoiding is the fact of our death. I mean, facts and reality remind us of our mortality. So anything that promises an escape from facts, an escape from reality, is incredibly appealing. And no wonder many politicians do exactly that. They're selling you the fantasy at some level that you're immortal, I mean, at some very, very deep level. But there is a liberation in giving the middle finger to reality. What's fascinating is that there is any desire for facts at all, judging that they're so unpleasant. And I think we need to think about, when do people want facts? When are they motivated to engage with facts? And even the most post-truth politician suddenly becomes incredibly evidence-driven when it comes to questions of, I don't know, building a bridge or a road. When you have to plan for something in the future that you have to achieve and that you need evidence to reach. So putting that into the world of ideology, what has been very, very apparent has been the disappearance of a discourse about the future for many people, because the future didn't seem to be bringing anything good. We can research when that breakdown happened, but it's not a coincidence that the thing that so-called populists or authoritarian populists across the world, they don't have that much in common actually ideologically, but they're all nostalgists. None of them have a vision of the future, and they appeal to people who feel that they have no future in many ways, and for many reasons. So I think that is going to be the key. If we're talking about political discourse, bringing back a discourse about the future. In journalism, I think there's still a lot more we can do with so-called solutions journalism. I don't think it's been approached in the right way at all. But journalism, which isn't just building identity, which frankly a lot of journalism does, and there's quite a lot of research that explores that, but is reaching towards solutions to problems. And we can go on and on about how we might change our political debates in ways that are less about ideology and identity, where facts don't matter, frankly, or get in the way, to having to find a solution in this world. Unlike you, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a sort of lapsed TV producer and media whore. But in the sense that I did very, very tabloid TV. I didn't do sort of clever TV or anything like that. I did 7 p.m. entertainment TV. And one day I'd love to go back to that. I just need like a couple of decades in academia to work out a way to make it good for society.
I love that answer because I think it identifies something that makes it clear that in order to address the disinformation problem, we're not simply waiting for someone else to save us. We're not waiting for journalism or the government or somebody else to come along and save us, that there are things that we can do as citizens. And because underneath what you said is, we need to figure out a way not just to get people to see facts, we need to get them to care about the future. because that's a future. If they care about the future, that's when facts will matter. But now I'm going to push the question one more iteration. How do you get someone to care about something that they don't care about? And this problem came up in my own work when I was writing an earlier book called How to Talk to a Science Denier, where it seemed to me that the problem was, well, how do you get people to, understand the facts? And I was talking to a fellow in the Maldives, and he said, in America, no one cares. Now, I hope he was wrong about that, but he said nobody cares about the Maldives. How do you get someone to care about something that they don't care about? How do you get, because I agree with you that some of what we're seeing these days are people saying, I don't care what's in my best interest long term, I want to win now, which flummoxes me. Why would I say, I don't want to take the COVID vaccine and I don't care if I might die because I'm going to own the libs? How does that happen? So is it more face-to-face conversation? Do we need to give that, part of the battle plan has to be for everyday citizens to know, here's what you can do. Because right now, we're frozen up. People are afraid to have that difficult conversation with their brother-in-law or their uncle at the Thanksgiving table. People don't want to have inconvenient conversations. Is there anything that we can do to take these tools, the battle plan that we're better at now, and not just depend on the people in this room and the people who are listening to do it, but to make it so that we've got 1 million foot soldiers? Because I've said in my own work, one of the problems with the information war that we're in right now is that we're all actually in it, but you can't win that war unless you know you're in it. And millions of people don't realize that we're in an information war every day. So not only how do we raise their consciousness about that, but give them something to do.
You're right, we can all play a role. But let's take the COVID example. So during COVID, I was doing some research on this, actually in Eastern Europe. And it's very interesting. The moment you actually you just call them, the people who don't believe in COVID vaccines. The minute you actually start doing proper sociological and audience research, you find that them breaks down. There are some people who you quoted who there might be some death drive issues. If you believe in such crazy notions as death drives involved there, it could get very dark. To the point where you're actually, you don't care about reality so much, you're ready to die for it. That's a very interesting psychological space, but that's a difficult category of people to deal with. But when we started talking to people, this was actually in the Baltic states and actually very interestingly in the occupied parts of Ukraine, where you could still research then, you found it broke down. You found some people there had a terrible experience with Chernobyl. There was a real lack of trust of government medical institutions. Where I work in Baltimore, there is a history of state medical institutions essentially using the local population in quite grisly science experiments, and there's a real lack of trust. So those people were actually engageable. You had to understand where their lack of trust came from, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I would do is get rid of this word them. I would get rid of terms like conservatives, because it's a pretty empty one anyway these days. I don't know, Fox News viewers, that's too big. The art of this is starting to break down audiences, understanding each motivations, understanding there are some you won't reach, and understanding there are others that actually you can start to build bridges to. So that would be the first one. And I do worry we can always slip into our own identity gains. We can go them out there. Our job is to not think like that. So in my new book, I had to do this somehow, which is about dealing with the most extreme polarization possible, because it's the polarization that was involved not in a culture war, but in a real war. And it's about British efforts to reach Germans during World War II and engage with them, people who they're literally trying to kill. And the hero of my book, Sefton Delmer, created media that was so relevant to German soldiers and civilians that they tuned into it and trusted it and believed it, despite them knowing the British were behind it. So they knew they were being killed by the people producing this, but he did so much research, and it's in the book how he did it, and it said so much about their motivations that he could provide them the information, but also the emotional content that appealed to them. But it's this fixation on the audience. It's meeting them where they are, not where we want them to be.
I love that because it recognizes that one thing that I think has been lost sometimes in the disinformation debate is that disinformation is not just intended to get people to believe a falsehood, but to distrust anyone who doesn't also believe that same falsehood. And to me, the issue has seemed fundamental, and this was true in science denial as well, and in so much of my earlier research, that the fundamental issue seems to be trust. And I love the story, and I can't wait to read your new book, about somebody who's, identifying, because does it take empathy? Is that what it takes? Is that what the foot soldiers can do, to understand the motivation, to say, I know you're afraid, but because without that, even people who are fighting disinformation can be polarized too. Polarized to think, I can't talk to somebody who doesn't believe in facts. Why should they care about me? And the interesting part for me here that came up in my own work is that if you read the stories, the anecdotes, this really hasn't been studied empirically, I don't think, hardcore science deniers change their mind when somebody takes the time to engage them kindly, with empathy, with respect, understanding what their motivations are, so that they made that human connection. Is there room, even with all of the disinformation coming at us that's not only misinforming us but polarizing us? How do we solve the gap, the bridge, where we can even have a conversation with somebody who's so deep in a conspiracy theory, so bewildered by what they're hearing? I remember being flummoxed one time when I heard that even before the invasion of Ukraine, that some ungodly number of folks in Russia watched state TV by choice when there was independent journalism, because that was the narrative that they preferred to hear. But does it come down to face-to-face communication? I mean, literally in the nitty-gritty, how to reach someone.
So look, I think. So let's be clear. There are empathy in terms of you've got to understand your audience. If you want to reach out to them for any reason, you have to listen. Empathy. Empathy has a touchy-feely bit to it, and I'm certainly not on the advocating to sort of like hug a fascist. Again, coming back to my latest book, the guy who was reaching out to these Germans had a very dim view of human nature. He thought Germans enjoyed Nazi propaganda. He thought it allowed them to articulate their sadism and their cruelty. But again, you've got to understand that's what you're dealing with. I do think it's important to think about aims. So if our aim is, in a democracy, to build a public sphere, which is a very misunderstood term and very hard to define, then we have to think about not just the individual interactions, but the systems that might enable that. And the great challenge that America faces is that it's completely unclear whose job that is in America. In Europe, we're getting there. We missed a terrible moment. We should have built a public social media, which we actually were going to in the 90s, but then didn't for stupid reasons. But at least people can think about that, because there is a tradition of generating a public sphere. In America, there is various kind of myths about how it might happen, but it's very unclear whose job it is to create social media platforms that will generate systemically a higher quality of interaction. And we can define higher quality. That's not an empty word. So that's one aim. In the case of Russia, the aim is to win. In the case of Russia, it's not about to convert people. It is to stop the invasion of Ukraine and to get the Russian leadership to change its calculations. One of the key calculations that they have is about internal control. We know from the actions of the Kremlin under Putin that when they feel they are losing control of the domestic situation, they change their policies. We've seen that over and over and over again. So the question is, what does one do, or what can one do to undermine their sense of total control? Yeah? And how will that lead them to change their war policy? That's the aim. It's not like to go and, rescue, rescue people's souls. It's very, very concrete. And the question we have to ask is, what is the role of information in that process? I mean, the biggest role is making sure that Ukraine gets enough ammunition. That's the biggest thing that will get the Kremlin to change its calculation. But the information environment and the domestic one do play a role. So we have to be very aware of aims. So yeah, I don't want it to sound that I'm sort of go and hug a fascist and everything will be fine.
I understand.
I don't mean one of those guys. Like, oh, they just need some love.
No. That's right. No, I understand. It's the, in my own work, I draw a big distinction between the people who create the disinformation, the people who amplify it, and the people who believe it. And it often seems to me that the people who believe it are victimized. These are the people who really get nothing out of it. I mean, the people who create disinformation, it's part of a strategic denialist campaign. They know what they want, and they understand that the way to get it is to provide the disinformation. You control the information flow, you control the population. That's the authoritarians' playbook going back for thousands of years. And one interesting thing to me about people who are duped is to think, well, they've already got something going for them. They don't want to be duped. But maybe they're simply misinformed about who's doing the duping, right? They don't understand. I mean, there was, and I'm going to quote this wrong, but I know there's been empirical work out there which shows that just a shockingly high percentage of people think that they can identify disinformation. That in their news, I would never fall for that. It's just something that other people would be persuaded by disinformation, but I never could. But then when you do the actual empirical study, you find that it's something like 4 or 5% actually can. So I mean, Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. So isn't at least part of it to convince people you can be taken in by this? I'll just close by saying when my dad was in combat soldier in World War II, and what people don't realize is that fascism was taking a foothold even in the United States just before World War II. There was a lot of rhetoric about this, and I think it was in the 1940s, the U.S. Army put out a film called "Don't Be a Sucker," which was about a training film, a black and white film about how Americans could recognize that person is trying to dupe you, that person is trying to fool you. So isn't at least part of it merely raising awareness that we're all susceptible to this? I don't want to hug the fascist. The fascist is the person who's creating the disinformation, bad intent, they know what they want. The people who listen to the rhetoric sometimes, I worry, are completely victimized. That is, they're so emotionally wrought by whatever manipulation they're hearing that they fall for something against their better judgment because they didn't even know that they were susceptible.
But you just sort of invoked so much history there. You talked about Mark Twain, the Second World War. societies, and actually in many ways, especially democracies, have always had a lot of disinformation, as in deceptive campaigns, as how you're defining it. That's not new, and we've long developed sort of systemic ways to deal with that. We go, actually, it's fine. It's part of an open society to have lies and truth and a boisterous discussion. And we have a little bit of regulation around speech when it's, actually indictively, positively, definably harmful to people's well-being, to people's physical well-being. And then we have things like, laws around slander and all these different things that kind of safeguard this space. But the aim is not disinformation or truth or any of these things. It's the idea of having a democratic discourse, which is, I think we now realize, kind of the magic ingredient of democracy. I'm being shut down. So I think the question we have to ask is not these endless questions, which are fascinating about truth and people and cognition, but actually what is systemically changed? And what's systemically changed is a technological change. And what do we have to adapt in terms of the technology, the regulation, in order to produce, not, I think, wiser people. People have always been rather feeble, and that's what makes them rather lovely. But an environment where democracy can happen, which means elections happening and people trusting them and saying, I lost or I won. Those basic things, trusting their courts, being able to converse with each other and even have a Thanksgiving dinner together without, well, maybe that was always awful. Let's not romanticize it. But anyway, those basic functions are what we need to protect. And we've got to really pass what is old and forever and has always been with us and what is actually new and therefore has to be tackled.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.